All right, I think we can get ready to start, and we'll wish everybody happy Mother's Day. I don't know, we should have had a shear on relations to your mother on Mother's Day, but you already mentioned it. Every day's Mother's Day, right? Just
Yeah, the truth is, Kibbud Av V'Em is a great topic too.
yeah. Okay, another time. Well, lots of
Okay,
Torah to learn. Okay, Bakasha, Rabbi Feldman.
okay. Good morning. So, in light of yesterday's parsha, I thought we would talk a little bit about the prohibition of embarrassing people in public, and we'll discuss in greater depth, hopefully time permitting, exactly the nature of the parsha connection. But let's start off with this specific, pretty intense prohibition that the Talmud, in a number of places, but in the greatest detail, the greatest length, in the end of the fourth chapter of Bav Metzia, tells us that there is a tremendous transgression involved in embarrassing people in public, and that this prohibition is so severe that it is equal on some level to spilling blood, to killing them. And that's a difficult idea to understand and to really appreciate exactly what that means. On the surface, it seems like a pretty extreme comparison, and the Gemara gives somewhat of a explanation in a physiological sense that we talk about spilling blood. So somebody who is embarrassed, so his face drains the blood, he blushes and he blanches. So there is a literal application in that sense, but that's not normally what the imagery is of spilling blood. So the idea that it's compared to murder is a very intense idea. And it's also associated with losing one's chelik and olam haba in the world to come. There's a lot of very intense imagery over there in that Gemara and elsewhere. And the commentaries try to figure out just what do we mean by this comparison. So is it just a way of saying it's extremely bad? Just a very strong statement of the damage that is done? Or is there some kind of literal comparison? And we know that unfortunately it has happened that there are people who, confronted with humiliation, have unfortunately sometimes chosen death as a preferable alternative. So theoretically, the concept does exist, humiliation that could be so intense that one might indeed feel like that is an understandable comparison. Is that what the Gemara is getting at? Is it really a way of saying that it's literally equal? So here we do find a difference of opinion among the commentaries. And it starts with a question of just how far are you going to go with this comparison, considering the fact that actual murder, the Talmud tells us, is Yeharig Val Yavor, that if somebody were to say, kill this innocent person, or will kill you, we're not permitted to kill the innocent person. So the question could equally be asked, so what if somebody says, humiliate that person or I'll kill you? So would you go that far as to say that that would still be the rule? That you wouldn't be allowed to do it even to save your life? It seems like a very extreme position to take. But this was a discussion that a number of commentaries considered, at least. And it seems to revolve around the central issue of just how literal is the comparison. And here we find the Rishonim breaking down into two camps among the earlier commentaries. That there were those who did seem to take it literally. Most prominently, Rabbi Yonah. Rabbi Yonah, in his Sefer Shari Tshuva, has a statement to that effect, while other Rishonim didn't necessarily take it literally. So most explicitly in that camp was the Meiri. The Meiri wrote in a few places that this is not meant to suggest an actual literal comparison. It's a derech azhara, derech tzachas. It's there as a strong language, as an exaggeration. It's there to suggest just a certain intensity. But we certainly don't mean to say that it should really be compared for all intents and purposes. And there's also a comment on the Tosfos on the side of the page in Masechah Sota that was subject to some conflicting interpretations, because Tosfos writes that if one really is to understand that this is Yeharg Vayavor, that this is in that category, that one has to give up their life, so then that would seem to contradict another statement in the Talmud, because the Talmud tells us that there are only three such transgressions. So why is this not listed together with those three? So the easiest answer would be to say because it's not literal, it doesn't deserve to be on that list. So the fact that Tosfos doesn't give that answer has led some, such as Briskerov and a few others, to say, "Oh, you see, Tosfos is also in that camp that says it's literal." Problem is, it's hard to learn too much from just what Tosfos doesn't say, because maybe the most obvious answer would have been to say that it's not really literal. But the second most obvious answer would be to say that it's not on the list because it is on the list. That if you understood it as really being a subset of murder, so then murder is part of the list. So that would also be a relatively straightforward answer. So Tosfos doesn't give that answer either. So it's hard to know what to do with that comment, and there's some debate about it. And overall, there's a lot of back and forth about this question. And what we would emphasize as an important takeaway is do not try this at home. Do not assume that this is actually a literal comparison, despite the discussion. The message that it's even something to talk about is a very powerful idea, because most of us, if we would humiliate someone else, we're doing that not because we have a gun to our head. We're not doing that because of life and death pressure. We're doing that much more casually. So to consider the fact that there were those who even discussed that it couldn't be done even when somebody is threatening your life. So even if we don't go that far, and we shouldn't go that far, but even consider such a possibility gives us a strong impact as to just how serious the danger is, just how serious the damage is. And the idea that it's not actually something to practice could probably be best explained by an article that was in one of the rabbinic journals many years ago. The author's name was Rabbi Pinchas Levinson. And he suggested the following approach, which is probably a good way to understand it, that the language of the Talmud, when it has this comparison and when it talks about this idea of possibly sacrificing your life. So, first of all, just to give some background, it's talking about a story in the Chumash, which is on its own a very difficult story to understand. And there is no really clear explanation of how to interpret it. But the story is told about Yehuda's daughter in law, Tamar. Tamar had been married to two of the sons of Yehuda, and she was supposed to marry the third because of the concept of Yibum, and she didn't want to, and so she and he didn't want to rather. So she tricked Yehuda into being with her instead, and she was pregnant. And Yehuda thought that it was from someone else, so Yehuda put her on trial. And she wasn't willing to expose Yehuda as the father. She only gave him the clue, the sign that would give him the opportunity to come forward and identify himself. So it sounds like that had he not come forward on his own, she would have been ready to be executed. And that was because she didn't want to embarrass him in public. So the Talmud says, you see from here, Noach lo li'adam sheyapil atzmo l'kivshan shel eish ve'al yalbim pnei chaver b'rabim, that it's preferable for a person to let himself be thrown into a fiery furnace rather than to embarrass someone else. So there's a lot that's very, very difficult about that story, because even if we do go so far with such a prohibition, But certainly somebody who's on trial for their life is certainly entitled and presumably obligated to defend themselves by identifying the real culprit. So to say that she would not have been permitted to do that, very, very difficult to understand. And the commentaries struggle with this tremendously, as you could imagine, because again, as a matter of practical halacha, there's no question that somebody who is on trial is certainly permitted to defend themselves and to identify the actual culprit. So it's a very difficult Gemara to understand, and it's a story from the Chumash is very difficult to understand. But the Talmud understands from there that apparently, despite that legal bottom line, it's still preferable for a person to avoid embarrassing someone in public, even at such a high cost. And there's another statement of Chazal that is parallel to that, or at least is a dispute that's parallel to that, because the Medrash says in Pashas Vayigash that when Yosef revealed himself to his brothers as the Yosef, as the one they had sold into slavery, so there, the Medrash highlights the fact that when Yosef was ready to do this, so he asked all of his bodyguards to leave the room. He sent everybody else away so that he could do this in private. And the motivation was apparently that it was going to be embarrassing to the brothers to be confronted with their whole history, and other people would be around, so that would be very embarrassing to them. So, in order to save them this embarrassment, he sent away all the people who were around him. And the Medrash has two opinions as to whether that was a good idea or a foolish idea. The idea that maybe it was foolish is that here the brothers are going to be very embarrassed, yes, but they're going to feel very much put on the spot, and they're going to think, okay, we're in trouble here. But luckily, he sent away the bodyguards. We can kill him and we can leave, and we'll be okay. So to take a risk like that, one opinion of the Medrash says that that was the wrong move, and the other opinion indicates that maybe this was an understandable and a praiseworthy move as part of an effort to protect them from embarrassment. So that idea that you find in these sources that maybe there is such a notion that one should risk their life rather than embarrass someone, again, as a matter of practical halacha, we don't recommend this. But the whole impact of these sources, so said Rabbi Levinson in this article, that what the Gemara is trying to show you is that the impact of humiliation could possibly be so intense that somebody would prefer to die instead. But you certainly can't know that that's what we're talking about when you're trying to imagine how a situation is going to play out. So there are so many variables and there are so many different factors that could impact what the situation actually is going to be, that the notion can't be actually put into practice. So to say that somebody should take a extreme measure, an irreversible measure, in order to prevent somebody from being humiliated, so that far we don't actually go in practice. But the notion that it's theoretically possible and it's something we should take great efforts to try to prevent, and certainly when we don't have such an extreme pressure upon us, is perhaps the major takeaway from these stories. And it's interesting also that Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is one of the greatest poskim of the 20th century. So he has a tshuva where he discusses this whole idea. And it was actually, it's interesting, it was taken further, perhaps a practical sense, although it was rejected by almost everyone who came after. There was a consideration of Rav Shlomo Kluger. Rav Shlomo Kluger was one of the great poskim in the previous century before Rav Shlomo Zalman. He was a very, very unusual thinker. He had always very interesting conclusions. So Rav Shlomo Kluger has a comment in his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch called Chachma Shlomo, where he writes as follows. He says that, and I'm kind of summarizing, he has a different way of getting to this conclusion, but this is also a related path. He says, let's say you pass a river and you see somebody drowning. So we know that you're obligated to jump in and save them if you can, if you have the ability to save their life. So we discussed last time, the previous parsha from then was Parshas Kedoshim. We discussed that pasuk of Lo Samod Al Dam Re'echa, that we're not allowed to stand idly by when somebody's life is at risk. We have to jump in and save them. So if you can save someone's life, then you need to do so. But if you know that you're not so likely to save their life, that you're not a very strong swimmer, and it's very dangerous waters, and that if you would jump in, it's just as likely that you would drown. Maybe you would successfully save the life, maybe you wouldn't, but you would be sacrificing your life. So then you're not expected to do that. You're probably not even allowed to do that. So that's itself a debate, but certainly not expected to do that. So if that's the question, so then says Reb Shlomo Kluger, maybe we should also say that if there's a circumstance where you could save someone's life, but to do so would involve humiliating yourself, maybe you're not obligated to do that. So we should again mention that all the later commentaries who talked about this did not accept this position of Reb Shlomo Kluger. They thought that was too extreme a comparison, that wasn't justified as a practical conclusion. And one of them was Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Reb Shlomo Zalman has a tshuva where he discusses that, and he discusses other applications of this idea of not embarrassing somebody else. And happens to be, if you read his tshuva, he does not necessarily reject the literal interpretation of the Gemara, but he still doesn't think that this conclusion is warranted, and he explains why not. And then he says he also has a hard time understanding that since we say that pikuach nefesh is doche Shabbos, right, that if somebody is in mortal danger on Shabbos, so we override the Shabbos in order to save their life. So perhaps we should say that the same should be true if you see that somebody is about to be humiliated and you can prevent it from happening. So then maybe you should be Michal Shabbos in order to prevent their humiliation. So he does not come to that conclusion. He's not sure why it's not the conclusion based on this logic. Doesn't come to that conclusion, but it says a powerful question. He says if we're talking about a rabbinic violation of Shabbos, if it's not a Torah violation, so then that may indeed be the conclusion, because the Gemara says also in a few places that kavod abrios, that the concern for human dignity overall, is a factor that can override rabbinic law. So if you're dealing with an Isser D'Rabbanan in Hilchos Shabbos, a rabbinic application of laws of Shabbos, so then if human dignity is really at stake, so then there could be indeed grounds for that to override the halacha. It depends on the circumstance, a very complex and tricky application, but that could theoretically be. But to actually violate Shabbos on a D'oraisa level, on a Torah level, so that he wasn't ready to say. It's interesting to note that there was one earlier work of responsa, didn't have the same impact, the same influence as with Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, but in the Sefer Shemi Shimon that was written by Rav Shimon Pollack, so he did indeed have the understanding that because of this comparison, that preventing embarrassment to somebody would override Shabbos. But again, it's not the general approach. And perhaps the answer could be the same as Rabbi Levinson suggested in the previous question, that it could be theoretically on paper that there could be a basis to override Shabbos to prevent someone from humiliation if you really had the sense that it was that kind of mortification, if you really had the sense that it was really going to be an embarrassment that was so severe that it could endanger someone's life. It's theoretically possible. So, in those circumstances, we would say that that should take priority over Shabbos itself. But to codify that halacha as a general practice, that's not something you're going to find, because in the usual circumstances, that's not what we're dealing with. And clearly, when we talk about such a comparison, whether you want to say the comparison is literal or not, so certainly there's got to be consideration for degree. That certainly if somebody were to spill spaghetti on his pants in the cafeteria, so it's embarrassing. But nobody would say that that's in this category. Nobody would say that that's worse than death. Clearly, when we talk about embarrassment, so it's important to appreciate that we're not talking about just any degree. There's got to be a certain level. We talk about the word mortification, so that's what the word means. Mortification comes from the idea that there really is a feeling like one has died. It's the same word, the mortality, more same comes from the same root. So that idea, we're talking about a humiliation of that extent. So that's something which maybe there is what to talk about. But when we're discussing general embarrassment, so no one would really think that it should enter into that category. And the idea that it ever could, so is something which we do find a few other discussions that center around this point. So, for example, there is a discussion the poskim have that we have a concept of Birchas Kohanim, that really in Eretz Yisrael it happens every day. In Chutz La'aretz we usually only see this on Yontif. We have Shavuos coming up. So we see that there is a notion of the Kohanim getting up and blessing the tzibur. And the Gemara says in the end of Maseches Brachos that a Kohen who has killed someone should not dochen. And it's a whole discussion what exactly the basis for that is, what the idea is. Is it because they murdered someone specifically, or could it be even if they killed someone inadvertently, or even maybe in self-defense, even if it's justified? Maybe it's comparable to David HaMelech, who didn't build the Beis Hamikdash because of people that he killed, despite the fact that he did so with justified circumstances in war. So that's a whole discussion as to how exactly to understand that halacha. But there is a question that's raised in some major poskim. Rav Vosner had the tshuva about this, and the tshuva Shevet Alevi, and Rav Nosson Gestetner, who's a great posek in Bnei Brak, had a tshuva about this, and his tshuva was Laharis Nosson, where they discussed the question of maybe we should say that a Kohen who goes around embarrassing people in public also shouldn't be involved in Berchos Kohanim. So these great poskim, the Shevet Alevi and the Laharis Nassan, they did not come to that conclusion. They didn't think that they would go that far. And they both said that they didn't think the comparison was actually literal, that you should say that all of the applications should carry over. And the Laharis Nassan actually says maybe one could question this point a little bit. He said that even if one were to say that it was literally equal to murder, we still wouldn't follow through with this particular implication, because the source for the idea that Gemara in Brachos is based on a pasuk in Sefer Yeshayahu. The pasuk says, "Yedechem damu maleu," that your hands are filled with blood, and apparently that's not appropriate for somebody who's going to be lifting his hands, called it nisias kapayim, in order to bless the congregation. So, therefore, Gestetner understands that even if embarrassing people was literally equal to murder, still it wouldn't be physically murder. And this idea of blood on the hands is a reference specifically to physical murder and the impact that that would have on a bracha that is conveyed through lifting the hands. So one could perhaps respond to that and say, but the bracha is actually conveyed through speech. And if one embarrassed people by the way he speaks to them, by things that he says, so then shouldn't that have an equivalent type of disqualifying effect on his speech? So it's a fair point, but it's in any event not where he comes to. So they don't come to the conclusion that you could actually compare this. But there are some svarim you could find that talk about the laws of Berchos Kohanim, and in some of the svarim they are more machmir on this. They do factor in this consideration that somebody who humiliates other people perhaps shouldn't be allowed to partake in the Berchos Kohanim because of that. And we find a few other discussions that bring up this question of just how literal it is. It's also a question of whether it should be included in the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, This was a discussion that the Shvus Yaakov has, Rabbi Yaakov Reicher, where he tried to figure this question out. Should we say that it's included in the seven Noahide prohibitions because one of them is murder? So if you have this idea as a subset of murder, if it's somehow part of the broad concept of Shvichus Damim, so then maybe we should say that it's already included in the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. It should be applicable to all of humanity in any event because it emerges from the notion of Kavod Habrios, which is a reflection of humanity being created in the image of God. But this specific idea of a prohibition that is connected to the notion of Shvichus Damim, should we go that far as to say that maybe it should be a subset of that prohibition, and everything that's included is going to come along, and therefore maybe we should call it one of the seven Noahide commandments as well. So there are all these discussions that you could find that talk about this question of just how literal is this comparison, just how much are we really equating, to what extent are we really equating the idea of humiliation and actually killing someone. And it's striking to note also that the Gemara takes this comparison in another direction as well and adds another element because the Gemara starts off by telling the story of David Hamelach. So David Hamelach, as we know, had a scandalous episode in his life with Bathsheba, and then he tried to repent from that, tried to do tshuva, and the Gemara says that people would publicly harass him because of this, and they would try to embarrass him. So the Gemara tells the story that he'd be giving a shir about something completely unrelated, and somebody would raise his hand and say, so tell me, King, I am Fred Barnes, National Enquirer. I have a question for you. So that's a fascinating shir that you just gave on the laws of Shabbos and cooking. So tell me, somebody who gets involved with a possibly married woman, what kind of punishment does that person deserve? So David responded, oh, that's a good question. So that person would be executed, but they at least would have a portion in the world to come. They'd have a chelik in olam haba. But somebody who embarrasses people in public would have no portion in the world to come. So, as if to suggest that what this questioner was doing was actually worse than what David was involved with in the past, which is a very strong statement itself. And there's a lot of discussion about this because where David is also bringing his response from, that there is no chelik in olam haba, there's no portion of the world to come. So where did he get that from? So you might say, well, he got it from Pirkei Avos. It's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. If you're learning Pirkei Avos over Sfiras Omer, so you may have come across that Mishnah in the third parak. So perhaps that's where David got it from. So yeah, maybe so. But where did the Mishnah and Pirkei Avos get it from? Where did this idea come from? So there are various suggestions as to how do we explain that? Why should it be that the idea of embarrassing someone in public should result in them losing their portion in the world to come? No chelik and olam haba. So there are different explanations of this. And in the Rishonim, you can find different explanations. And they may actually line up with the question of how do you relate to the first question we started with? That do we say that the comparison to murder is literal and that there's actually a halacha of Yihar Yavor, or is it not literal? So Rabbeinu Yonah, for example, so we mentioned before that he was one of the Rishonim, one of the very few Rishonim who did seem to take it literally in his Shari Tshuva. And here also he seems to relate the ideas because in his commentary to Pirkei Avos, so he explains the reason that there is no chelik in olam haba for somebody who humiliates someone is because they deserve this punishment as a murderer. So then he goes on to explain that you might say, well, wait a minute, that we don't actually find such a punishment connected with murder. that somebody who murders someone else, we don't have a source to say that that person has no chelik in olam haba. So to that, Rabbi Yonah explains that the difference is that in the case of someone who actually commits physical murder, so there's going to be a tremendous uproar against what he did, and there's going to be many societal implications, and he will realize that he did a terrible transgression and a horrible crime, and he will probably come to repent. So he'll pay whatever price he pays in this world, and he will perhaps repent and therefore have a chelik in olam haba. But somebody who humiliates others, so he may have just as bad of an impact, but he's never going to feel that that's his responsibility. He's never going to feel like he did anything directly. He's going to feel like this is just my style. This is just the way I talk. It's not my problem. And he's not going to necessarily repent. So when the Talmud says, so whatever consequence it describes, no chelik olam haba or the like, it's working off this premise as well, which is an important idea to appreciate. It's something that Ramosha Feinstein talked about in his commentary to the Gemara in Bav Metzia and his Dibros Moshe, that the statement that there's no chelik in Olam Haba is working off the premise that the person doesn't do anything to correct it, it doesn't do tshuva, and that that's a part of the statement, that the expectation is that indeed such a person who won't try to fix it, he's not going to do tshuva, because it's not perceived that he did anything serious. It's not something that is connected to any type of a severity that actually is there. So the individual who perpetrates such an act is not going to be moved to repent. And that is a part of the underlying presumption of all of these statements. So from Rabbeinu Yonah's explanation, you see that Rabbeinu Yonah is, we say, l'shitaso, is consistent with his own opinion, that he believes that it really is equal to murder, and therefore the comparison is justified. While the Rambam, it's interesting to see that the Rambam also has a explanation that's consistent with his opinion. Because when it comes to the question we started with, the issue of Harig Val Yavor, should you really risk your life not to do this? So many understand from the language of the Rambam that that's not the case. The Rambam is very limited when he talks about martyrdom. So he lists only those big three transgressions that one is obligated to risk his life for. And he says that anything outside of this list, it is prohibited to risk your life. And as many of the commentaries understood, that if humiliation was a part of it, he would have said so, because he didn't create any in between space. So many understand that the Rambam did not see this comparison to be literal. And that's also relevant here to his explanation about this idea of Olam Haba. So if you look at his commentary to the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, so there, Mishnah and Sanhedrin has a whole list of people who don't deserve a place in the next world. And the Rambam explains that these actions, such as embarrassing people in public, there he says, that if somebody commits this action, not once, but somebody who regularly commits this action, so then that is an indication that he is a part of a very specific halachic category known as a jerk. And a person like that, it's safe to assume that he's probably not on the list. So, in other words, it's not because this transgression right away gets him kicked out, but it's because having this as a character trait that you do regularly, so that's probably a reflection of a very low character. And it's a safe guess that this is not a Ben Olam Haba. This is probably not a person who has earned a place in the next world. But the Rambam seems to also be Lishitaso here. He seems to be consistent with his own opinion that this is not a one-to-one correlation. It's just a reflection of a person's general attitude towards others and their character overall. So there's another explanation of this whole issue, which is particularly interesting. And this could also maybe help us to understand a little more of the practicalities here. And there are some who suggest that the idea of there being no portion in the world to come if you humiliate people, let's say according to the Rambam, if you humiliate people regularly. So there are some who explain that that actually is a proportionate consequence. That actually is what we call midah keneged midah, because the whole idea of a eternal soul that can enjoy olam haba, the world to come. So where does that come from? So that comes from the notion that we are created in the image of God. We are created b'tselem Elokim. But as we indicated before, the source of tselem Elokim, of being created in God's image, that's also the source for another concept. That's also the source for the idea that there is a obligation, a mandate of human dignity, that we have to treat everyone with respect because they are created in the image of God. So somebody who just casually humiliates people, such a person is apparently denying the idea of being created b'tselem Elokim, doesn't believe that humanity is created in the image of God. So therefore, perhaps it's a midah connected midah. It's proportionate that therefore the olam haba reward is also connected to that attitude. So that points us in the direction of an interesting principle here to try to understand. And to take the whole question a little bit further. So there are some who discuss all of the details of the phrase. In the Talmud, it says that the Avera that we're talking about, that we've been referring to the whole time, is referred to in the Talmud by the phrase Malbin Pnei Chavero Birabim. It's somebody who humiliates people in public. So there's a lot to try to figure out about the impact of that phrase. Just first of all, malbin literally translates to whitening someone's face. The word lavan. So that might be a little bit surprising because perhaps you would have guessed, if you're going to get a color involved here, that if somebody is embarrassed, they turn red. So why does the Talmud call embarrassing someone whitening their face? They should call it ma'adim penei chaver b'ravim. You make somebody's face turns red. So the truth is, there actually are some texts that have that variant that say ma'adim pnei chavero, but certainly it's far more common to see it as it is malbin pnei chavero. You turn the face white, and some of the commentaries explain that when somebody is a little embarrassed, so yes, they blush, their face turns red, but when they're really mortified, like we're discussing, this higher level of humiliation, so then their face turns white because all the blood drains from the face. That's what we call blanching. And therefore, that's what the Talmud is referring to when it talks about malbin pnei chavero b'ravim. And again, it suggests a much deeper level, like that word mortification, a much deeper level of humiliation than just a basic embarrassment. So that's as far as that opening phrase, malbin pnei chavero. But what about the last word, barabim? So is that a necessary clause here, that in order to be a part of this discussion, are we talking specifically about embarrassing someone in public? What if you embarrass someone in private? So how does that fit in? So here there was a discussion among the Rishonim. There's some who felt that it meant literally embarrassing somebody in public specifically. And there were those who understood that even embarrassing people in private is also a violation of the prohibition. So there are some who kind of split the difference and who suggested a in-between approach. And it goes as follows, that if you embarrass someone in private, so yes, that's prohibited. But if you embarrass someone in public, so that's when it takes on the consequence that we've been talking about, that is potentially compared to murder, and chelik and olam haba, and the whole discussion about Yahari Vayavu, all of that, that's specifically about somebody who would embarrass someone else in public. But in private, so it's just prohibited without all of these significant consequences. So that requires a deeper analysis here. So why would you make a split like that? How would you be justified in distinguishing along those lines? So perhaps you could say as follows, that we've been talking about this whole time, the prohibition to embarrass someone in public, and we didn't take the time to explain where does that prohibition come from. So where do you find in the Torah that there is such a prohibition? So the most basic answer is in yesterday's Kriyas Torah. That's a part of why we're talking about it now. That yesterday's Kriyas Torah, there's a prohibition of lo sonu, that we are not allowed to afflict others, and they're not allowed to oppress other people. And the Torah repeats that phrase twice in Parshas Bahar. And the Gemara Chazal understand that there are two prohibitions being addressed here. One is a type of monetary oppression, of price fraud, but the second prohibition, the Gemara says, and as Rashi explains in the Parsha, if you got a chance to see yesterday, that Rashi explains what's referring to. It's referring to onas divarim, that if one inflicts emotional pain on someone else through their speech, so that is prohibited by the Torah in this context. So that here the Mishnah in Bava Metzia, and the end of the fourth parak of Bava Metzia, the Mishnah has a whole list of examples of how you could inflict emotional pain on someone, or how you cannot inflict emotional pain on someone. And among the examples are if you remind someone of their past transgressions, or you remind them of their ancestors' transgressions, or if you put them in situations where they're likely going to be embarrassed. You tell somebody to go into a hardware store so they can buy a gallon of milk, and everybody will look at them strange when they go in to do that. So whatever it is that's going to put them in a humiliating circumstance. So all of these are examples of this general prohibition of onas dvar. And many other examples also. It's a wide-ranging prohibition. It has many applications. And it's not even just about the words, it could be about even just gestures. My father, Zichron Livracha, liked to quote the idea that Rabbi Saul Salanter had said that if somebody walks around with a scowl on his face, so he is making everyone else upset at the way he's looking at them, so that is a problem. And he would note that a person's face is not private, a person's expression is not private. It's a rishus harabim. It's out there in the public thoroughfare. So maybe that's why a lot of people will cover their faces with masks, so it shouldn't be seen that they're upset. So that will protect people not only from getting physically sick, but from getting bad feelings from the way they are looking at them with their expression. But that's how the Sefer Yereim actually understood that it's possible to violate the prohibition of an Dvarim just by having a negative countenance. So there are many different applications of this idea of an Dvarim. The truth is, it could talk for another hour just about some of these applications. It's a very wide-ranging topic. But in the most intense way, if somebody is inflicting humiliation on someone, so that is certainly onas dvarim writ large. So there's no question that there's a violation of that prohibition when somebody inflicts humiliation on someone else. But there's another source also. The Tashbetz in his commentary to Pirkei Avos points this out, that have at least two sources for the obligation of the prohibition of humiliating someone. And the other source we read in the Parsha, in Parshas Kedoshim, to go back a little bit further, and we spoke about this, I believe, a little bit, that there is a obligation of tochacha in the Torah. I think someone had asked about this, but we have an obligation of providing rebuke, that if somebody is behaving in an inappropriate fashion, so then the Torah says that you have to correct their misbehavior. So in that context, the Gemara in Erechin notes that one could have thought that maybe we should do that even if it will result in the person we're speaking to being humiliated. So the Gemara says, Yochol afilu yishtane panav, that maybe we should think that we should do this even if his face will change color, even if they're going to be so embarrassed by the way we're rebuking them that it's still necessary to do. So the Talmud says you can see that's not true from the end of the pasuk. That if you keep reading, so the pasuk goes on to say, "V'lo siso alav chet," that you should rebuke someone, yes, but you shouldn't get yourself in trouble because of them. So how do you understand that concern? That you shouldn't get yourself in trouble. You should not incur an avera yourself. So the Gemara is apparently telling us that if in the course of rebuking someone you would inflict humiliation on them, so that itself would be a transgression of its own kind. And the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs comments that this is an example of the idea that sometimes when the Torah conveys a prohibition, it does so in the more extreme circumstance, and you can figure out that it applies all the rest of the time. So here you have somebody who may feel justified in embarrassing someone because of this mitzvah of rebuke. So it's in that context one could have thought that it was actually a mitzvah. So we're told that no, it's not a mitzvah, and you're not allowed to do it even then. So you understand from there that if you can't do it even in that circumstance, so then, all the more so when you don't have that justification, when you're not trying to correct their misbehavior, so then for sure you're not allowed to humiliate someone. So, what emerges is that we have really two prohibitions here of not embarrassing people in public, one from yesterday's parsha from Unas Devarim, and one from Parshas Kedoshim of Velosisa of Chet. So, what's the need for two prohibitions? It seems like we're addressing two different aspects here. That if somebody embarrasses someone, so on the one hand, they are inflicting emotional pain, they're causing them to feel some degree of suffering on the emotional level. And then on top of that, that they also could be making their face change color because they are striking at the Tzelem Elokim, they are taking away their dignity in a public setting. So it would seem that if somebody embarrasses someone in private, so that's a prohibition because it's onas devarim. But if somebody embarrasses somebody in public, so then it has this added dimension of taking away their tzelem elokim, of reducing that sense of being created in the image of God and having public dignity. And that's what would be violated by the language of Eloisisol of Chait, that there shouldn't be a transgression that should accrue to the person who is doing this. So perhaps we could understand through that this idea that there are these greater consequences that are associated specifically with public humiliation, even though by itself there's still a prohibition of an devarim. And again, an devarim, there it really requires its own hour. There's so many different applications. There's so many different instances that we find that emerge from this prohibition. So that shouldn't be taken lightly by itself. That's a very serious prohibition, even without the public humiliation element. There were those who suggested there should be malchus attached. There should be lashes that should be given to somebody who would violate onas tvarim as a Torah prohibition. Others objected to that. It doesn't technically fit the categories that have lashes, but it's a very severe prohibition nonetheless. And I think the Rambam has the language that harve shluchim yesh l'makom l'fro me'over itzono, that God has many messengers who can extract payment from those who will violate His word, whether there's a formal bezdin punishment or not. So there's a lot to say and a lot to go along with Anas Tvarim and this larger prohibition of Habanas Pnei Chaver Barabim. And we'll just add that the Gemara itself mentions another element that the Gemara says very severe consequences of somebody who would embarrass someone in public. And the Gemara mentions another example of somebody who has very severe consequences. Hamachane shem roa lechavero. That's somebody who creates a negative nickname, a disparaging nickname for someone else. So there the Gemara asks, well, yeah, that's a subset of embarrassing people in public. Why do we need to be told that as if it's a separate transgression? It's the same idea. You can't embarrass people in public. And if you call them by a demeaning nickname, so you will be embarrassing them. Why does that need its own category? And the Gemara explains like a dedoshpe. That's the kind of thing that people are used to already. So when you initially create this new nasty nickname, so it'll be very embarrassing. And then it's so widespread that people don't pay attention so much anymore. You might think it's not such a big deal. So the Gemara says, no, even then, even once it seems like it's kind of softened in its impact, but still it has this effect of embarrassing a person. Rashi writes over there that's the intent. So therefore, it's also in this category, and it brings with it all the severity of the prohibition of embarrassing people in public. So there's a lot more to say about it. There's certainly a lot more to say about the concept of onos devarim. But for now, suffice it to say that it includes all kinds of suffering that is inflicted through words, and very much included with that would be people who keep others waiting too long because they're speaking too much. So I can't go overtime, but I know we have to allow some time for questions. So, by Kelman, would you anything you want to put forward in the minutes that we have?
Then I was unmute. I was muted. No, you're not overtime. Okay, that's no. Okay, let's
Not
take.
done overtime yet, but I have to allow some time for questions.
Yeah, okay. So let's take a look here. Yeah, just a few comments and questions. Tamar, her intentions are not stated. Okay. I guess that's adds to the ambiguity of the story. Asking, did I okay. Did what Tamar have from Yehuda, would anybody else have been able to identify it? I'm presuming not. That's the whole point of the story, but
Yeah.
who knows? I don't know. But um okay, but as you say, it's a difficult story because halachically you're for sure allowed to defend yourself in a court of law. Question is, why
Yeah.
did she do that? I don't know that you would address that. Why did Tamar? Why
Yeah,
was
I don't have a satisfying There's a lot written, but it's a little outside the scope of our discussion. I don't have a satisfying explanation because it's very challenging. There is a minority view in the Rishonim, actually, that the punishment would not have been death, even though it talks about burning, that it was some kind of branding, that that's what they did then, but it wouldn't have actually been execution. But it sounds like from the Gemara like it's more than that, and it's hard to find a a satisfying explanation. It certainly seems like what she did was not required by halacha. It really prompts the question if it was even permitted or even appropriate. And it's true that we don't necessarily know what her intention was from the Chumash itself, but the way the Talmud portrays it, that it has relevance to this question. And there's a lot written trying to figure it out because there's a lot of complexity to the story. But what's important to appreciate, practically speaking, is that it certainly doesn't seem to be bottom line halacha. So somebody who is in a consequence, who's in a context in which they need to defend themselves, should feel that they still can do that, and that perhaps they must do that in order to bring about justice and address things properly. So, as a matter of practical halacha, the story of Tamar is very, very difficult to understand and to explain in a satisfying way. But the Talmud does invoke it, and one suggestion could be that still it was a voluntary act. Even then, it raises questions, but even saying that it was a voluntary act perhaps reflects the very high sensitivity that comes along with this embarrassment. So, the notion, it's also interesting, to want to reflect on it a little bit further. So giving Yehuda the opportunity to come forward on his own. So that, as we've also seen in many contexts of life, it does mitigate the embarrassment somewhat. That when a person has the ability, like they say, to get in front of it, to decide to take the initiative themselves, to own an embarrassing situation. So that does make a difference as far as the impact. And that's a part of what we're seeing reflected in that story as well. But again, as a satisfying way to make it all fit is still a challenge, as commentaries all struggle with over there.
I mean, I don't know that we have to make it fit. I mean, Tamar's not like a halakhic authority. In other words, if you want to just on a simple basis, in other words, we want to learn something here, but Tamar, presumably, no, I'm not even getting to the fact that it's before Matan Torah, even ignoring that whole aspect. I mean, she was basically willing to prostitute herself. I mean, you can't exactly say that she was personally derived. So I don't know, maybe that's part of the answer.
It
But
could be, except that again, the Talmud invoking it as a model would make it harder.
yeah, I hear. Okay.
Right. So
Um,
it's challenging either way, but it's easier within the Chumash than it is within the Talmud. The Talmud clearly holds her up as some kind of a role model, if
yes.
not a mandatory role model. So it's a challenging discussion.
I guess, I mean, you had mentioned, but I guess Len wants to know the sources equating mitigating humiliation with pikuach nefesh. That I guess a person can be Michal Shabbos, what have you.
Yeah. So by Kelman, if you want to share the chapter in the right and the good has a lot of
Right.
the
So I'm
sources.
not sure I know how to share that. Like I just have the book, but I don't have it in a
Right. So it's
PDF.
there's a lot written there. It's hard to know where to start, but I if I may, I will refer people to the first chapter of the right and the good.
Yeah, here. That's this book right here. The Right and the Good Halacha and Human Relations. Yashar Books, I think, right? That's is there a further edition? I'm not aware.
That's the third edition, the one that you're holding.
Oh, I already have the third edition. Okay. All right. It's well worth getting all the topics. And then there's the second book we spoke about, Divine Footsteps, and the one on Lashon Hara we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. Okay. So if you want to very, very briefly talk about a Kohen who killed somebody, Rahman al-Islam, if it can do the army, the car accident, things like that, how that might impact.
Yes, that's difficult to give you a conclusion on because it is a significant machlokas poskim that there are many different views la halacha, and it revolves around the question of, is it a consequence of the avera of murder? Is that what we're talking about? Or is it a statement that just the theme of shalom and of peace and love that the bracha is supposed to connote, that's incompatible with the causing of death of any kind? So even if it was in self-defense, so then maybe that still doesn't matter, even if it was justified. So even if somebody was heroic, saving lives in the army, then maybe we should say still it's still comparable to David HaMelech, who was stopped from building the Beis Hamikdash for similar activities. Although there's some discussion about that also. Maybe the concern with David HaMelech was that maybe some of the people didn't deserve it. So maybe he was defending Klal Yisrael with most of it, but if he ever made a mistake, so then maybe that's why he was concerned that there was an impact. We find that in the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach, where the Torah says, "Vayira Yaakov Ma'od Vayetzelo," that Yaakov was very afraid of his confrontation with Esav, and he was afraid for himself, and also Vayetzelo, he was anguished that maybe he would have to kill someone in self-defense. So there's a whole discussion about the impact of killing someone in self-defense that seems to also, as we could understand, also be a source of anxiety. We think that would be enough to explain it, but there's some who feel, well, if it's self-defense, we need to explain a little bit more, and that maybe the concern was maybe he would miscalculate, maybe he would kill somebody without it really being justified by self-defense. So that's a whole complex discussion. I think there are many who are makel on this because they see it specifically as connected to the avera of murder. And there's a lot of discussion. It's hard to give you a absolute bottom line because there are different practices, and there's also that in between category of somebody who was a shogeg or somebody who was negligent, and I could give you sources about that, but it's an extensive literature that don't want to oversimplify.
Okay, good. And then I have a number of people defending Tamar, I guess, from my comment, and what she was doing really was a mitzvah, and only to, she was promised that she could marry into the family, and they weren't letting her, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's there. She would have been quote unquote an aguna. All right, it is exactly 11 a.m., which means then your time, we are at the time, so to speak. As you said, you're nervous about that, so want to thank you. And 11:15, 15 minutes, Rabbi Leaptag, and please God, we'll see you next week. And okay, everybody should be well, have a Shavua Tov, be healthy, safe, and all good things. And we said 15 minutes, Rabbi Leaptag talking on Parshat Mishpatim, when the laws of the Torah were given, legislation, the revelation and legislation. So we can take a cup of coffee, take a little walk, and we'll see you in a few minutes. And tomorrow, of course, being Yom Yerushalayim, Rabbi Shvat's shir on religious Zionism will focus on aspects of Yom Yerushalayim, and that's at 11 a.m. tomorrow. And tomorrow night, of course, Mark Shapiro. Okay, we'll see you soon.